Well, hello and good morning. I'm very happy to be here today as part of our 2022 Research for the Public Good annual conference. This is our annual research event within APUS to showcase faculty and student work and to promote research at the university. As we've noted right before we started, there are a number of events live today through the end of this week. If you go to our event website, we also have pre-recorded on-demand presentations, which I really encourage you to go out and view at your own time, as well as our student lightning talk competition, where you can vote as part of the public voting for those 3-minute student lightning talks. So I encourage you to do that and support our students' work as well. I'm very happy this morning to have Dr. Yukinori Komine with us presenting the research from last year's internal research grant, which he's conducted. And we're very excited to hear about that project and what he's been doing. So I will turn the floor over to Yuki.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this session of research grant presentations. My presentation is a summary of main findings from last year, 2021 research grants. I have received, when I received the invitation for this opportunity, I have obtained a list of questions to present. So I am organizing PowerPoint accordingly. So what was your research question? My topic is about multi-archival research on the question of nuclear proliferation, non-proliferation in Northeast Asia. And there are two main questions I have listed here. Why do states with a significant material capabilities decide to choose non-nuclear weapons security options? Why do states avoid choosing nuclear options? And then the other question is, if states choose to not to go toward nuclear weapons options, how do they ensure their survival in an anarchic world of politics? These are two main questions. And I have chosen 3 case studies, basically: Japan, South Korea, and the Republic of China, Taiwan, and examined their respective processes of security policy decision making. And why is the project significant? There are 2 main reasons. Compared to some other regions, such as the Middle East, there is less study on the question of alliance restraints. Alliance restraints in Northeast Asia. Basically, alliance restraints meaning a major power, major external power, trying to restrain junior powers' policy options regarding nuclear weapons development. And many analysts and Asia watchers have referred to the possibility of nuclear weapons development among some regional powers. However, there is not much in-depth study regarding behind-the-scenes decision-making processes, as well as negotiations between a major power and junior partners in the case of Northeast Asia. So those are the reasons I have chosen to pursue this. How did I answer some of the questions I have presented? I have conducted multi-archival research. Basically, during the pandemic, I was unable to travel to different countries to conduct archival researches, and therefore I have used online database available these days from archives from different countries. So for the US and Japan, I could use primary sources basically directly. And then Australia and Yes, in the case of Australia, I have also had the online access. And in the case of South Korea and Taiwan, I used the Japanese and the English translations for declassified. And my intention is to make an in-depth assessment of the so-called black box. We cannot see what is happening in the decision-making process from outside, but the documents and interviews with former officials, as well as oral history collection and published memoirs of former decision makers, can help analysts and those who are interested in this type of topic to get to know what was actually happening within a decision-making process. And then I am interested in exploring a possible gap between what the policymakers state in their public statements and then also what they're discussing behind the scenes. What did I learn from this study? Basically, I have found that the principal impact on the decision-making process was the external security environment, mainly the relative distribution of power resources among involved states. And then also there is an asymmetrical effect, basically between a major power and then the junior partners. Major power constrain the options and activities of junior partners, while junior partners also try to influence a decision-making process over major power. However, their influence is limited, and that is due to the external security environment, the relative distribution of powers. And then finally, there was interestingly limited effective effect of domestic political structures, and then also domestic norms. Domestic power structures, in the case of Japan, it has been democratic state throughout its decision-making, basically, to choose non-nuclear weapons option. In the cases of South Korea and Taiwan, both states have experienced transformation from an authoritarian regime to a democratic regime in the 1980s. And throughout the process of political transformation, their decision making and also policy options to consider nuclear weapons options behind the scenes were consistent. And then finally, nuclear anti-nuclear norms, which was very powerful in the case of Japan, but in the case of South Korea and Taiwan, because of the prolonged existence of the authoritarian regimes, anti-nuclear norms did not evolve until the late 1980s. And it has been more influential these days. But when these two countries, these two political entities, initially decided not to go nuclear, anti-nuclear norms themselves were not so influential. So what are my next steps? I have two manuscripts under review regarding case studies of advanced development of non-nuclear weapons policy, security policy. And then altogether, these case studies could be put together, and I would like to pursue a book project. And because of the opening of some more archives in different countries, I think I can get back to fieldwork, revisit some archives which I have visited several years actually before the pandemic. And then I have also other projects which are in parallel with this nuclear question. And those include territorial problems in Northeast Asia, including China-Japan dispute regarding the southwest islands of Japan, Okinawa, and then the Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands. And then another project is about Japan, Russia, back then the Soviet Union, controversy, dispute regarding the so-called northern territories and South Kuril Islands. So those are other projects which I have been working on simultaneously. So those are my main findings and summaries. Thank you for listening, and I welcome any feedback, comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Komine. I was curious, do you expect or anticipate some of those domestic norms and opinions in Korea and Taiwan to start changing with our current, global political dynamic that's happening right now with the conflict in Ukraine and China and Russia strengthening their relationship? I was curious your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much for a very timely and then policy relevant question. In the case of South Korea, there has been a generational perceptual gap between the senior generations and the younger generations. And for senior generations, going to nuclear is not really a practical option. They are still aiming at eventual long-term reunification with North Korea. However, for younger generations, they have been used to the existence of two Koreas. And then ever since they were born, basically, there are two Koreas. And the growing influence of North Korea's nuclear development has been pressing them to develop South Korea's defense capabilities. And then that includes hypothetical, conceptual nuclear option. And then it's been in political discussions in South Korea's domestic politics. It is not an immediate policy option. However, conceptually, it is no longer taboo. And then they have been more openly discussing hypothetical nuclear option. In the case of Taiwan, Taiwan has lost its official UN representation position in October 1971. And since then, basically, it is the People's Republic of China in Beijing, which is representing the official China, the entire China. And Taiwan, after it gave up its secret nuclear option in the late 1980s, has rather become a more advocate of a non-proliferation of nuclear weapons in Northeast Asia. But these days, because of China's increased assertiveness and its pressure on the cross-strait situation, Taiwan is increasing its exchange and the dialogue with the U.S., a main political supporter, and then some other northeastern states, including Japan. And Taiwan's deterrence, basically, is depending on U.S. presence in Northeast Asia, as well as U.S. bases in Japan, as well as conventional defense capabilities of Japan in particular, and then to lesser extent, South Korea.
Thank you. I'm sure you could write a book alone on Taiwan's shifting sentiment here. Definitely deeply complicated.
Very controversial.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that really thorough response.
Thank you for asking.
I do have a question. Of course. I do have a question here from Steve Ware regarding the choice of not engaging in a nuclear weapons program. It is my understanding that Japan is bound by a World War II treaty that does not allow this activity. Did your research indicate an interest on their part? What is the likelihood this treaty will be dissolved in light of world tensions in the region?
Japan has been avoiding pursuing nuclear weapons for many different reasons, but one possible concern is that Japan's indication of its nuclear intentions could trigger arms race in Northeast Asia. If Japan goes nuclear, others may follow. And then in Northeast Asia, basically there are two nuclear, well, three actually, nuclear armed states: Russia, China, and North Korea. And then all of them have other authoritarian domestic structures, regime types. And Japan's case, in addition to the fear of triggering arms race, Japan, the government itself is proclaiming that it is responsible as the only state which suffered nuclear attacks at the end of the World War. It is responsible to promote non-nuclear, non-proliferation of nuclear weapons in the international community. However, at the same time, Japanese leaders are clearly aware that Japan lives in a very unstable and dangerous international security environment. And therefore, by promoting the US-Japan alliance, Japan is developing its own conventional defense capability while relying on US so-called nuclear umbrella protection in cases of regional contingencies. But it is also possible that among some younger generation, this is similar to South Korea, among some younger generations, there has been perceptual difference these days. Younger generations prefer more assertive Japanese security and foreign policies. And then it is no longer taboo in Japanese domestic political discussions to refer to a hypothetical, conceptual nuclear weapons. Thank you for the question.
Yuki, I was curious, you talk about the sort of power dynamics within Asia, and you also talked a little bit about the UN. What do you think is the United States stake in nuclear weapons or non-nuclear weapons within Asia, and how do we try to impact that diplomatically?
The US government, thank you for the question, and also comments. The US government has been consistent in its policy of non-proliferation, basically. And it has been dealing with China's nuclear weapons program, and then also North Korea's nuclear capabilities. China's nuclear explosion was 1964, and North Korea has been developing and testing itself since the early 1990s. And then for the US, the principal objective in Northeast Asia and also the rest of the world is to prevent the emergence of a single dominant power in any given region. And then in the case of Northeast Asia, there was a possible competitor, rival. During the Cold War, it was the Soviet Union, and then currently it's China. And the US has been working on its Northeast Asian partners, mainly Japan and South Korea, to cope with the rise of China's military capabilities. And then these days, Australia has been in the power game, and then also India has also been power game. Well, so US is working with partners and allies in Northeast, rather than trying to act unilaterally or without consultation. So the so-called network of US alliances and then also political partnership has become much more effective and then operational in the case of those are my observations. Thank you for your kind question.
Samir has a question. He asks, are we prepared, I assume the United States, and ready for nuclear conflict? That's a big loaded question, Samir.
I cannot prepare or I cannot predict future, but I can share with you some of the things I have come up with. I am going through documents and then also talking. In Japan's case, what's happening in last several years is that they have been talking about the so-called nuclear sharing, meaning that the US would reintroduce nuclear weapons into its bases in Japan in cases of regional contingencies. In addition to that, Japanese leaders, including the late former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, suggested that Japanese self-defense forces bases, which are also some are also shared with the US forces, should be open for semi-permanent installation of nuclear weapons coming from the US. And then Japanese forces should also obtain more knowledge and then operational skills about how to operate in cases of regional contingencies, and including North Korea's use of nuclear capabilities. So it's, at least in Japanese domestic political discussions, a hypothetical scenario. Politicians are interested in suggesting those possible policy options. However, Japan's own nuclear weapons option itself still remains conceptual and then hypothetical option rather than an option of practical. Thank you for your question.
Where are you hoping to go next in terms of your archival research now that travel is a little bit more available, Yuki?
I'd like to try California. There are several major ones, including Reagan Presidential Library. It's, in the U.S., there is a general pattern of declassification 25 years or 35 years after an event takes place. And these days, analysts, investigative journalists are revisiting the end of the Cold War era. And it is because of the rising tensions between the US and its partners against China and Russia. So analysts are trying to draw some possible lessons from cases of easing tension between rivals, which was an important political trend during Reagan. So that's one possible destination. But also, I'd like to visit some other archives in Japan as well, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs archives and some research institutions and their co-sponsor archives in various prefectures. Thank you for your question.
Dr. David Kritz has a question for you. He asks, how did you determine what archives to use to conduct your research?
How did I? Well, archives, these days, they are quite open and then also quite advanced in their digitization. So even without going to archives, analysts and those who are interested in this kind of topic project can have access to some documents, and then the number has been increasing. So you can choose topics, subjects, countries, and decision makers, and then do some background studies, literature, and going through some journalistic about events and then what have become known over years. And then contact archives directly and ask a list of questions, introducing topics, and then ask specific questions about events or some issues which have not really been known sufficiently among the public. And in my case, the reason for my interest in the Reagan era was what I just have explained. And in the case of what I have just presented, Northeast Asians, non-proliferation, I have worked on several background studies projects by going through a number of published books and journals, and then selected the specific countries and then cases. So those are the things what I do. Thank you for your question.
Do you have any more questions for Dr. Komine? Lots of comments about enjoying your presentation. And Leslie Lewis said, it's very interesting. I did not realize that some of this information was that easy to access.
It is amazing. Sometimes overwhelming, actually, that so many documents have become available. And then these days, a lot of former policymakers talk. They say, this is what I was doing, this is what we were talking about. And then sometimes it is interesting that documents and then what the former policymakers say do not really much. For example, just one quick example. There was a review conference forum of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which took place in Cuba several decades ago. And then analysts and then archivists wrote a number of documents, declassified documents, and former policymakers attended also from the US and then Russia, back then the Soviet Union, then also Cuba. And then policymakers are saying, this is not what we meant. Then analysts said, but the documents say you made this and that decision. So sometimes recollection, what the policymakers remember or how they wanted to remember certain documents and then statements may not really much complete. So that's one interesting thing. And then if you're interested in this kind of talk, it would be interesting to cross-examine different types of sources, which would create multi-layers for analysis and explanation. Thank you for your question.
Well, with that, thank you so much for being here. I did put the event link in the chat for everybody if you'd like to join us at 11 a.m. And thank you, Dr. Komine. This was really excellent.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time and attention. Thank you also for comments and the questions.
Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you later.